The photograph was hanging on the far wall of the gallery, matted in simple black frame, exactly the way I would have framed it myself. I stood in front of it for a long time before I trusted myself to move closer. Even with my eyes the way they are now, everything at the edges gone soft, colors bleeding slightly into each other, I would have recognized that image anywhere. A young soldier, no older than 20, slung across another man's shoulders, both of them caked in mud and something darker, moving through smoke toward a field hospital that existed, in that frame, as nothing more than a suggestion of light at the edge of the composition. I had taken that photograph 45 years ago. I knew every grain of it, every decision I'd made about exposure and framing in the 4 seconds I'd had to make them. Beneath it, a small placard read, "Private collection, seller anonymous." "Mr. Nash?" Sofia Alvarez appeared beside me, her voice careful in the particular way people's voices go careful when they're about to say something they suspect will complicate an already complicated afternoon. "There's someone here who'd like to meet you," she said. "He asked me to bring you to the back room before the reception starts." "Who is it?" I asked. She hesitated, glancing toward the doorway behind her. "He said," she said slowly, "that you saved his life." I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite recognition, not yet, but the particular unsettled feeling of a door about to open onto a room I hadn't stepped into in 45 years. I thought about my son. I thought about the 4 photographs missing from a collection I'd trusted him to protect, and the quiet lie he'd told me about a moving van and boxes gone astray. I thought about the 8 months of small, mounting inconsistencies I'd chosen out of love, or perhaps out of fear, not to examine too closely. "Mr. Nash," Sofia said gently, "are you ready?" I looked once more at the photograph on the wall, the young soldier, the mud, the smoke, the light at the edge of the frame that had, 45 years ago, meant the difference between a life saved and a life lost. "Yes," I said, "I think I finally am." If you found this story tonight, I'm glad you did. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. It helps more than you'd think to know real people are on the other end of this. A brief note before I continue. This story blends fiction with purpose, crafted for entertainment and the lessons worth carrying home. Names and details are coincidental. What you take away from it, though, is entirely yours to keep. I want to tell you something before I tell you everything else. There's a version of what happened in that gallery that my son might tell, if you asked him. In his version, I imagine he's a man who made one desperate mistake under financial pressure, a mistake he intended to fix quietly before anyone ever had to know. I understand, in some sense, why he might need that version to be true. Shame has a way of asking us to make our worst decisions smaller than they actually were. I can only tell you what I know to be true, the way I spent 35 years learning to document truth for a living, carefully, without embellishment, letting the facts of a frame speak for themselves rather than deciding in advance what story I wanted them to tell. My name is Walter Nash. I'm 70 years old. For 35 years I worked as a conflict photographer, most of that time overseas, documenting things most people only ever see secondhand, at a careful distance, through a newspaper or a magazine. I was never a wealthy man in the way some careers reward you, but I built something else instead, a body of work that outlasted the moments it captured, images that, in a few rare cases, actually changed something in the world beyond the frame itself. I raised Ethan to understand the weight of a photograph, the responsibility that comes with holding a piece of someone else's history in your hands. I thought he understood that completely. I still believe some part of him does, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this actually began, not in that gallery, not with a placard reading "Seller Anonymous." Let me start 45 years ago, in a field hospital tent that existed at the edge of the worst 4 seconds of my professional life, and the debt of gratitude that photograph created, a debt I never once expected to be repaid, and certainly never expected to see resurface the way it did. I was 25 years old the day I took that photograph, 3 years into a career I'd fallen into almost by accident, working freelance for a wire service that paid barely enough to cover film and travel. The soldier's name was James Coyle. I didn't know that yet, not in the moment. I only knew there was a young man bleeding badly from a leg wound, another soldier struggling to carry him alone across open ground toward a medical tent that seemed, from where I was crouched with my camera, impossibly far away. I want to be honest about something that still complicates how I think about that photograph, even now. I raised my camera before I put it down to help. That's the truth of it, and it's a truth I've carried uncomfortably for 45 years. I got 3 frames, 3 quick exposures capturing the exact moment the second soldier's strength began to give out, his knees buckling under Coyle's weight, before I set the camera down and ran forward myself to help carry him the rest of the way. The photograph that ran in papers worldwide months later wasn't a moment of quiet heroism I'd stood back and simply observed. It was a moment I'd hesitated inside of, weighing my responsibility as a witness against my responsibility as a human being standing 20 feet away from someone who might die if nobody moved faster. The image, once published, did something I hadn't anticipated. It became evidence in a much larger argument about inadequate field medical resources. Congressional testimony referenced it. Medical logistics changed as a direct result, over the following 2 years, in ways officials later credited, at least partially, to the public outrage that photograph helped generate. I won an International Photography Award for it the following year. I never once, in the decades since, felt entirely comfortable accepting that recognition. I'd built an entire career, in some sense, on 4 seconds of another man's worst day. I never learned what happened to James Coyle afterward, why photographers rarely got that kind of closure. You took the image, filed it, and moved on to the next assignment, the next crisis, the next 4 seconds that might matter to someone reading a newspaper on the other side of the world. I didn't know, standing in that field hospital 45 years ago, that the photograph itself, the physical prints, the negatives, the entire body of work I'd build around moments like that one, would someday become something my own son would decide, quietly, was worth more to him sold than kept. Ethan was born 4 years after that photograph made its way around the world, and by the time he was 3 years old, I'd built a reputation significant enough that opportunities began arriving that I'd once only imagined for other photographers, book deals, gallery representation, and eventually, when Ethan was 6, an invitation to serve as a juror for one of the most prestigious international photography prizes in the field. It was the kind of invitation that doesn't come twice. Serving as a juror for that particular award meant standing among a small handful of photographers whose judgment the entire industry respected enough to trust with deciding whose work mattered most that year. It would have meant 3 weeks in Amsterdam, meetings with people whose names I'd admired my whole career, a level of professional recognition that, frankly, would have changed the trajectory of everything that came after. Ethan got sick 2 weeks before I was scheduled to leave. Severe pneumonia, the kind that terrifies you precisely because a 6-year-old's lungs don't have much room for error. I remember sitting in the pediatric ward at 2 in the morning, Diane beside me, both of us watching a small chest rise and fall too fast, listening to a doctor explain, carefully, that the next 48 hours would tell us a great deal about how this was going to go. I called the jury committee the next morning and withdrew. I want to be honest about how difficult that decision was, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came later. It wasn't a simple, obvious choice made without hesitation. I sat with the decision for hours before making the call, weighing a professional opportunity that would never come again against a son who needed his father in a hospital room instead of an airport. I chose the hospital room. I've never once regretted that choice, not for a single day in the 41 years since. I never told Ethan about it directly, not until he was much older, and even then, I mentioned it only briefly, almost in passing, during a conversation about a different opportunity he himself had once had to turn down for family reasons. I didn't want him carrying the weight of a sacrifice I'd made willingly, gladly, without expecting it repaid in any particular way. He cried a little when I told him, I remember. You gave up something that big for me? He asked. I'd do it again tomorrow, I told him, and I meant it completely. I didn't know then that decades later, sitting in a hospital bed of my own kind, my eyesight failing, my independence slowly narrowing, I would trust that same son with the most valuable, most personal body of work I'd ever created, and that trust would end up costing both of us something neither of us saw coming. My eyes started failing about 5 years ago, macular degeneration, the slow, creeping kind that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but instead erodes the edges of your vision gradually, until one day you realize you can no longer trust your own perception of a photograph the way you once could. For a man who'd spent 35 years making a living from precisely that kind of trust, the diagnosis landed harder than I let on to anyone, even Diane, in the years before she passed. Diane died 3 years ago. After that, living alone in the house we'd shared for decades became increasingly difficult, my vision by then narrow enough that I'd started missing things, a step, a curb, once, embarrassingly, an entire flight of stairs I misjudged the depth of. Ethan insisted I move in with him and Rebecca, and I agreed, grateful, in a way I hadn't fully expected to be, for the offer. The hardest part of that move wasn't leaving the house. It was deciding what to do with my life's work. Decades of original prints, negatives, contact sheets, the entire physical archive of a career built one careful frame at a time. My own home no longer had proper climate-controlled storage, and my failing eyes could no longer be trusted to catalogue and protect it the way it deserved. Ethan offered to convert the unused basement space in his own house into a proper darkroom and archive room, humidity-controlled, light-controlled, everything a serious collection required. I understand what these mean, Dad, he told me, better than anyone. I'll take care of them like they're my own. I believed him completely. I want you to understand that clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that came after. Ethan had built his own career in photography, commercial work, mostly corporate headshots and product photography, respectable but a different world entirely from conflict faux journalism. I'd always privately hoped some part of him understood the weight of what I'd built, even if his own path had taken him somewhere gentler. We moved 60 years of archival material into that basement room over the course of a weekend, box by careful box. I remember running my fingers over the edges of prints I could no longer see clearly, trusting my memory of their content more than my actual vision, trusting Ethan even more completely to make sure nothing happened to any of it. I didn't check on the collection often after that. My vision made it difficult, and more than that, I didn't feel I needed to. I trusted my son with the most valuable, most personal thing I owned. I had no idea, for the better part of 2 years, how badly that trust was about to be tested. Before I go any further, let me pause here for a moment. If you're still with me, drop a comment below and let me know. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. It helps more than you'd think to know there are real people listening on the other end of this. A quick reminder, this story blends fictional elements into its storytelling, crafted for reflection as much as entertainment. If it isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what I discovered next is the part that changed how I understood my own son. Ethan's commercial studio had struggled for the better part of 2 years before any of this happened. I knew this only in vague, general terms. A downturn in corporate photography contracts after a large client relationship ended badly, an expensive lease he'd signed on a larger studio space just before that downturn hit. He mentioned it occasionally, in the careful, minimizing way people mention financial stress they don't want you worrying about. I didn't know how deep it had actually gotten. Rebecca, I'd later learn, hadn't known the full extent of it either. Ethan had been managing a growing portion of the debt quietly, on his own, the particular isolation of a man too proud, or too ashamed, to let the people who loved him see how badly things had actually deteriorated. I noticed the first gap in the collection almost by accident, roughly 8 months before that afternoon in Sofia Alvarez's gallery. I'd asked Ethan to retrieve a specific print for me, a smaller, less significant image from an assignment years before the Coyle photograph, something I wanted to reference for an interview a journalism student had requested. Ethan came back upstairs longer than the retrieval should have taken, and when he handed me the folder, his explanation felt, even to my limited eyesight, slightly too rehearsed. I think it might have gotten misplaced during the move, he said. I'll keep looking. You know how disorganized that basement still is. I accepted the explanation at the time. It seemed reasonable enough. 60 years of archival material, moved in a single weekend, some disorganization was hardly implausible. But over the following months, it happened again and again. Each time, a slightly different explanation, a box mislabeled, a folder temporarily loaned to a colleague for a project, a scanning error that had somehow corrupted the digital catalog entry for a piece that should have had a corresponding physical print. I didn't want to believe what some part of me had already started to suspect. I want to be honest about that. There's a particular reluctance that comes with doubting a son you raised, a son you sacrificed a career-defining opportunity for without a second thought, a son you'd trusted completely with the most valuable thing you owned. I told myself for months that my failing eyesight was making me paranoid, imagining patterns that weren't really there. I didn't fully understand how wrong that reassurance was until the day Sofia Alvarez called me directly. Sofia's call came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, my phone ringing while I sat in the living room listening to an audiobook, the particular quiet, uneventful kind of afternoon I'd grown used to since my eyesight made most other activities more difficult. "Mr. Nash," she said, her voice warm and professional, "I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. My name is Sofia Alvarez. I run a small gallery here in Portland, and I'm helping curate photographs for an upcoming book on conflict photography from the past 50 years. I told her that sounded like a wonderful project, genuinely pleased, the way I always was when someone reached out about the field I'd given my working life to. "I'm calling because a piece recently came into a private collection I'm helping catalogue," she said. "A photograph attributed to you, a soldier being carried to safety. Absolutely remarkable image. The collector who acquired it mentioned it came from a direct sale, and I wanted to confirm the details with you personally before including it, just to make sure our documentation and licensing are accurate." I felt something go very still in my chest. "A direct sale," I repeated slowly. "When was this sale, if you don't mind my asking?" "About 6 months ago, according to the paperwork I have," she said. "The seller's name was listed as Ethan Nash. I assumed, given the shared last name, that this might have been a family transaction you were already aware of." I sat in my living room for a long moment, the phone against my ear, feeling the particular vertigo of a floor giving way beneath something I'd trusted completely. "Ms. Alvarez," I said carefully, "I wasn't aware of that sale at all." There was a pause on her end, the sound of someone recalculating a conversation they'd expected to go very differently. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Nash. I hope I haven't overstepped by bringing this to you directly." "No," I said. "I think you've done exactly the right thing. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you know how many pieces this collector acquired through that same sale?" She checked and came back a moment later, her voice careful. "According to my records, 4 separate photographs, all attributed to you, all sold within the same 8-month window." 4 photographs. I thought about the folder Ethan had handed me 8 months earlier, the mislabeled boxes, the scanning errors, each excuse a little more elaborate than the one before it. "Ms. Alvarez," I said, "I think I need your help with something, and I think it might take a little while to explain properly." I called Peter Grant the following morning, an old friend from my early wire service days, who'd left photography decades earlier for a law career specializing in intellectual property and image rights. We'd stayed close over the years, mostly through the particular friendship of 2 men who'd once shared cramped hotel rooms in dangerous places and never quite lost the bond that builds under those circumstances. "Walter," he said, once I'd explained what Sofia had told me, "I want to make sure I understand this correctly before we go any further. You're saying your son sold 4 original prints from your personal archive without your knowledge or consent?" "That's what I'm saying," I told him, my voice steadier than I actually felt. I need to know exactly what's happened before I say anything to him about it. Peter spent the following week tracing the transaction history through licensing records, sale documentation, and, with Sofia's careful, professional assistance, contact with the anonymous collector's representative. What emerged was more extensive than even Sofia's initial call had suggested. 4 photographs, sold over an 8-month period, each transaction structured through a private art broker who specialized in discreet sales for sellers who preferred to remain unnamed. The total amount Ethan had received, according to the broker's records Peter was eventually able to access through a professional contact, came to just over $110,000, considerably more than the modest sum Ethan had once mentioned needing to bridge a temporary cash flow gap at his studio. "Walter," Peter said, when he called to walk me through everything he'd found, "I have to ask you something difficult. Do you want to pursue this legally? Because from where I'm sitting, what your son did constitutes theft and unauthorized sale of property that was never legally his to sell, regardless of where it was physically stored." I sat with that question for a long time before answering. "I don't want to destroy my son's life over this, Peter," I said finally, "but I do want the truth, all of it. And I want the photographs, if there's any way to get them back." "There might be," Peter said slowly. "Sofia mentioned the collector who purchased them has expressed interest in meeting the original photographer. Apparently he's been trying to arrange a conversation with you directly for weeks, through the gallery. Something about wanting to understand the story behind the most significant piece in the collection." I thought about the photograph that had defined my career, the one that had made everything else, the awards, the reputation, the archive my son had eventually decided to quietly dismantle, possible in the first place. "Set up the meeting," I told Peter. "I think it's time I understood exactly who's been holding onto my life's work." Sofia arranged a small private reception at her gallery 2 weeks later, framed publicly as a preview event for the upcoming conflict photography book, an entirely legitimate occasion that happened, conveniently, to also serve the purpose Peter and I had quietly designed around it. I asked Ethan to come. I didn't tell him why, only that a gallery was featuring some of my work and I wanted him there. Some part of me, even then, wanted to believe there was an explanation that would make sense of everything, some version of events that didn't require me to fully reconcile what my son had actually done. I stood in front of the photograph, my photograph, the soldier, the mud, the smoke, when Sofia came to find me. "There's someone here who'd like to meet you," she said gently. "He asked me to bring you to the back room before the reception starts." James Coyle was 74 years old, silver-haired, leaning slightly on a cane, and the moment I saw his face, something in my chest recognized him immediately, even across 45 years and the blur of my failing eyesight. "Mr. Nash," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't try to hide. "I've been trying to find you for months. I didn't know your name, not until I saw the photograph come up for sale and started asking questions. I didn't even know if you were still alive." I found myself unable to speak for a moment, standing in front of the man whose worst day had become, decades later, the foundation of everything I'd built. "You saved my life," he said simply. "I've thought about that day more times than I could count. I never got the chance to say thank you." "You don't owe me anything," I told him, the same words I'd used with so many people over the years, though this time they felt different, heavier, carrying 45 years of weight I hadn't fully understood until that moment. "When I saw your photograph come up through a private sale," James said, "I didn't understand it. It felt wrong somehow, a piece of my own life being traded like an object. I bought it, and then I found out there were 3 more from the same seller. I bought those too, because something told me they shouldn't be scattered into strangers' collections. I wanted to find whoever sold them and understand why." I felt my chest tighten. "James," I said quietly, "the person who sold them was my son." His expression shifted, surprise giving way to something more careful. "Your son sold his own father's life's work." "I only just found out myself," I said. "He's here tonight. I think it's time he understood exactly what he did and who he did it to." Ethan arrived 20 minutes into the reception, scanning the room the easy, professional way photographers do at industry events, until his eyes landed on the far wall and the photograph hanging there. I watched something drain from his face in real time. "Dad," he said, crossing the room quickly, his voice already unsteady, "what is this? Why is that here?" "Ethan," I said quietly, "I'd like you to meet someone." James Coyle stepped forward, and I watched my son's expression shift from confusion to a slow, dawning horror as Sofia, standing beside us, explained gently who James was and how exactly 4 of my original photographs had come to be sitting in his private collection. "You're the man in the photo," Ethan said, his voice barely audible. "I am," James said, his own voice steady but not unkind. "And you're the man who sold it, along with 3 others, according to the paperwork I've seen." Ethan's face went through several stages in rapid succession, denial forming and then collapsing, almost immediately under the weight of documentation Peter had already gathered, documentation Sofia had already confirmed, a truth that had simply become too large and too thoroughly proven for any explanation to survive contact with it. "Dad," he said finally, his voice breaking, "I can explain. I swear I can explain." "Then explain," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "The studio was failing," he said, the words tumbling out now, unrehearsed, raw in a way none of the previous excuses had ever been. "I signed a lease I couldn't afford, right before 2 of our biggest clients left within months of each other. I was drowning, Dad. I didn't tell you, I didn't tell Rebecca, I just kept trying to fix it myself, and it kept getting worse. And then I remembered the archive, and I told myself you'd never miss 4 photographs out of thousands, that I'd buy them back eventually, before you ever found out." $110,000, Ethan, I said quietly. "That's what those 4 photographs sold for. Where did that money actually go?" He was crying now, openly, in front of James Coyle, in front of Sofia, in front of a small gathering of strangers who'd come expecting an art reception and found themselves witnessing something far more personal instead. "Some of it went to the studio debt," he said. "Some of it, Dad, I'm so ashamed to say this, some of it went to things I convinced myself we needed. A better car, Rebecca's parents visiting, and me not wanting to see how bad things had gotten. I was so afraid of you knowing I'd failed at something after everything you sacrificed for me that I made it so much worse instead of just telling you the truth. Before I go on, let me pause here for a moment. If this story has reached you tonight, drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever watched shame make someone you love choose deception over simply admitting they were struggling? I read every comment, and it means more than you'd think to hear from you. A gentle reminder, this story carries fictional elements, woven in for reflection as much as entertainment. If that isn't for you, this is a good place to step away, no hard feelings at all. But if you're staying, what happened after that reception is the part I still think about most. James Coyle spoke before I did, once Ethan's confession had finished unraveling in front of all of us. "I want to say something," he said, turning to face my son directly. "I don't know you, and I'm not going to pretend to understand everything that led you to this point. But I do know what it cost your father to be in that field 45 years ago, and I know, personally, what that photograph meant, not just to his career, but to people like me who lived through what it documented." He turned to me then, his expression softening. "I'd like to give them back," he said, "all four. I never wanted to own a piece of someone else's family the way this turned into. I bought them to protect them until I could find the truth, not to keep them from where they belong." I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since Sofia's phone call weeks earlier. "James," I said, "you don't have to do that. You paid fair value for them." "I know I don't have to," he said, "but I'd like to. And I'd like to give you the difference between what I paid and what I think they're actually worth, because I think that difference should go toward whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again." The following weeks were harder than the reception itself, in some ways the quiet, difficult work of actually rebuilding something between Ethan and me, and between Ethan and Rebecca, who I learned, in the days after, hadn't known the full extent of the debt or the sale until that same evening. Ethan sat with me alone 3 days later in my own living room and told me everything he hadn't said in front of James and Sofia, the specific fear that had driven him, the particular shame of feeling like he'd never quite lived up to the career I'd built, the terror of disappointing a father who'd once given up a career-defining opportunity without a second thought. "I should have just told you I was drowning," he said. "Instead, I stole from the one person who's never once asked me for anything in return for everything he's given me." I didn't have an easy answer for him. I still don't entirely, but I told him what I believed to be true. "You didn't just take photographs from me, Ethan," I said. "You took the choice away from me to help you the honest way, the way I would have gladly helped you if you'd simply asked." The 4 photographs came back to me 2 weeks later, carefully packaged, James Coyle delivering them himself along with a check that, when I finally understood the amount, made me sit down heavily in my chair and stay quiet for a long time. I didn't cash that check right away. I sat with it for nearly a month before finally depositing it, and when I did, I split it 3 ways, a portion toward establishing a small scholarship fund for aspiring photojournalists, a portion set aside for James's own charitable interests at his request, and a portion, smaller than either of those, that I quietly used to help Ethan and Rebecca finally, honestly, restructure the studio debt that had started this entire unraveling in the first place. Ethan insisted on paying that portion back on his own terms over time. I let him. I think, in some strange way, that mattered more to both of us than simply forgiving the debt right would have. James and I've become unlikely friends since that reception. He visits every few months now, and we sit together in the basement darkroom Ethan built, developing prints by hand the old way, the technique neither of us ever fully abandoned, even as the world moved on to easier methods. There's something quietly healing, I've found, in watching an image slowly emerge in developing solution with a man whose life that same darkroom process once helped save in its own strange, roundabout way, decades before either of us understood how the story would eventually come full circle. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. A photograph can hold a single moment perfectly, forever, exactly as it happened. Trust is a much more fragile kind of archive. Once it's damaged, even carefully, even for reasons rooted more in shame than malice, rebuilding it takes far longer than the moment it took to break. I'm not angry at my son anymore, not the way I was standing in that gallery watching him unravel. I understand, better now, how far shame can drive a person from the truth, especially a person terrified of disappointing someone they love. If you see any piece of yourself in this story tonight, if fear of failing someone has ever made you choose deception over simply asking for help, I hope you find the courage Ethan eventually found, even if it came later than either of us would have wished. This is what a quiet revenge dad means to me. Not cruelty, not anger, just an old photographer who spent his whole life capturing other people's most vulnerable moments, finally learning to sit patiently with his own. If this story reached you tonight, leave a comment and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story on this channel. Thank you for staying until the very end. A last gentle note, some upcoming stories on this channel contain fictional elements, crafted for reflection and life lessons. If that isn't for you, no hard feelings.